the main goal of training is to induce mitochondrial adaptations anyway. So why would you now teach the body, and can you really teach and communicate that with the muscles to be using more fats? And I don't think you can do that. If nutrition and hydration are okay, and the cooling is fine, then this drift in heart rate is definitely a result of being in the heavy exercise intensity domain. They can use the Villa Max, but don't explain it as a maximal production of lactate, and don't use the units, and then I'm perfectly fine with this Villa Max concept. You really have to make sure when you're trying to lose body mass that you fuel well for those high intensity training sessions. So I usually try to avoid any energy deficit before those training sessions. Having a very high watts per kilo, but having low absolute power, you just can't do anything on the flats. And I think we can see this pretty clearly on the results on the time trials in professional cycling. Coaches shouldn't be afraid to be asking people with PhDs or professor titles about their work, because they are most of the time more than happy to provide them with answers.
Okay, Tim, welcome to the podcast. How you doing?
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm doing great.
It's really good to have you on. I actually emailed you yesterday. We had been talking for a few days about scheduling something, but I just had an opening, and you were kind enough to respond on very short notice, and so here we are today, recording this podcast. Maybe for the listeners that don't know you yet, could you give us a brief introduction as to who you are and what you do?
Okay, so yeah, it's pretty long list of things that I do these days. Basically, I have a PhD in exercise metabolism. But my background, so these days I'm working in the cycling world, more or less, trying to bridge the gap between science and practice. But my background is actually it's from the sports perspective, it's actually sailing. I've been a sailor for more than 10 years.
What category?
At some point,
or any in particular?
It was laser, now it's Ilka class, I think.
Okay, I don't know the Ilka, but I worked with Nico. He's a Swiss sailor, and he was in the laser category up until the end of last year as well. So that's as much as I know about sailing. So I'll let you continue.
Yeah. So basically, I was a sailor, and then at some point during my undergraduate degrees, I was studying sports science, and I figured out there is no money in sailing, so perhaps I should be doing something else. So I decided to become an expert, and I really wanted to pursue my career as somebody that knows a lot about sports science. And then I started looking for a sport that would be helpful in getting into to better understand science, and I got into cycling. And since then I've been in love with cycling, and obviously then reading stuff, you want to try everything on your own, and that's what I've been doing. And for a few years now, I've also been doing work with athletes, more nutritional perspective. So currently, a few years later, I am employed by the University of Birmingham, where I work as a research fellow, so doing studies. But also, I am a nutritionist, one of the 2 nutritionists for BORA hansgrohe cycling team. And I also have a lab in Slovenia, physiological lab, where we do testing and coaching of athletes. So I'm also involved in that work. And I also consult to a sports nutrition company, Endurance, just because I was struggling to find good products in the market, and there was an opportunity to help in that regard, and I got involved. That's probably it.
That's about it. Well, that gives us quite a few avenues to go down and chat today. First thing that came to mind, do you think cycling attracts so many exercise physiologists because it's fairly easy to quantify, and it's stable, and you could do it inside, which kind of makes it very, very accessible from a measurement standpoint?
Yeah, obviously. So cycling is probably the easiest to measure like external workload, so power output, but also like even taking blood and doing like experiments. It's much easier. For instance, yeah, taking blood from a runner, it's very difficult, so you have to stop him. And also like with those cannulas inserted, they can fall out because of the movement. Whereas in cycling, everything is like stationary except the legs are moving, and everything is much easier. That's basically why I also prefer to do studies in cyclists.
I want to talk about exercise metabolism and understanding substrate utilization a little bit better, and then we'll maybe go out of the micro and go to the macro and how we apply then those different approaches or principles to exercise. So could you give us a brief overlook of what we're focusing on when we talk about exercise metabolism? We have free fatty acids, we have glycogen, we have glucose, to a lesser degree protein that's involved as well. How do you conceptualize this, the interaction of the different systems that exist in the body, and how they deal with utilization of different substrates at different intensities of effort?
So usually when we talk about like exercise as such, without like recovery period and pre-exercise period, we usually talk just about fat and carbohydrates, and we leave out protein because it's oxidized at very little quantities, and it's also very difficult to quantify protein oxidation rate. So we just like say that protein oxidation rates are negligible, so kind of, yeah, we leave them out. And we start about talking about fats and carbohydrates. And yeah, carbohydrates are basically coming in, let's say, three forms during exercise. So one is glycogen in the muscles, one is liver glycogen, and then we have exogenous carbohydrates. Those are basically the ones that we ingest during exercise. And then we have fats coming from the fat deposits. Those we have like in adipose tissue, but there is also some fat in muscles themselves, so intramuscular triglycerides that can also be used during exercise. And we kind of, yeah, try to figure out how to kind of reduce the reliance most of the time on glycogen use, increase the reliance on fats and exogenous carbohydrates, because this way this usually means that we prolonged the time to task failure in like different scenarios.
So if we talk about reducing time to task failure, we can also, I guess, extend that and talk about maybe recovery. A term that comes to mind is having a flexible metabolism or metabolic flexibility, and be able to go to where we need to oxidize a high proportion of glycogen when we need to produce high powers, but then also come back and, so to speak, switch back and recover, faster and better at those lower intensities. So it does truly apply to both the effort in and of itself, but also repeated efforts, and then maybe events over multiple days. Do you see that also being a point of interest in terms of developing that capacity to oxidize fats and to be efficient from a metabolic standpoint?
So yeah, this is probably something that we kind of comes back to like the starts of the carbohydrate periodization a few years ago, when kind of it's been proposed that you can alter carbohydrate availability before, during, and after training sessions to induce adaptations such that would in the long term mean higher fat oxidation rates at low intensities, and let's say still maintain the ability to oxidize carbohydrates at high intensities, because basically low carbohydrate diet for prolonged period of time, it just results in higher fat oxidation rates, but also a reduction in ability to oxidize glycogen. So basically you lose that ability to perform at high intensities. So they came up with this idea, well, let's periodize the carbohydrate intake so that, you just introduce carbohydrates for those hard sessions, but for instance, kind of reduce the amount of carbs you have before and during easier training sessions. So in this way, you will basically teach the body to use fats at those intensities. And while I was a believer of this approach for a number of years, and I've tried this on my own, it kind of works to the point when you do like 12 hours a week. It kind of helps this probably with adaptations, because withstanding carbohydrates, you induce more stress to the body, and you basically feel it that something is, you improve to a bigger degree. But then when you start training like 15, 16 or 20 or even 20 hours plus per week, withholding carbohydrates before one single session can just mean that the recovery will be so long that you will just not benefit, and you will just need to take a day off that you didn't plan initially. And also, like, when you start thinking about it, and also what determines fat oxidation rate during exercise, you start thinking, well, it's basically mitochondria, right? So the main goal of training is to induce mitochondrial adaptations anyway. So why would you now like teach the body, and can you really teach and communicate that with the muscles to be using more fats? And I don't think you can do that. It's a similar like analogy would be like eating protein to gain muscle mass without doing resistance exercise. It just doesn't work, right? And I think it's pretty similar here. So if you can maximize the training, increase the volume, you still have time to get better at training. That's the first priority. And only then, when you kind of, you have 15 hours a week, for instance, that's what I have. I start playing with these fasted training sessions to increase the stress on the body, just because, I simply can't do more volume. But otherwise, I'm not a believer that you can actually teach the body to oxidize more fats. And even if you look into the literature, just withholding from carbohydrates or reducing the amount of glycogen in the muscles, this just basically means that the body will automatically switch to utilizing fats, and carbohydrates are preferred fuel because simply it's a more efficient fuel for the body, and it will first be using glycogen when it's possible. So
I wanted to go maybe a little bit deeper into those, and maybe if you could put some values on those different substrates. Is it correct to say that even if we're, let's call it the fat max area, or the intensity zone, if I may call it that, or let's say the bracket of intensities where you might have the highest fat oxidation, is it right to say that fat oxidation rate is still considerably lower than the glucose oxidation rate at those intensities, or do we truly have, you're actually using more fats than sugars at any point in the intensity distribution?
No, I think it's still like the biggest proportion comes from carbohydrates. It's just that fat oxidation rates are, the total energy expenditure is so high that the fat oxidation rates is also like pretty high, around like 1 gram, up to probably, most people up to 1 gram per minute, whereas in carbohydrates terms, it would be like 3 or 4 grams per minute at the same intensity. So it's still like carbohydrates would still win it, but the fat oxidation rates would be pretty high. And if I may add, I think this like kind of fat oxidation rates that they start to decline, for instance, after you go to above the first lactate threshold. In a way, this is still kind of debatable, and I think in the future some data is going to come out from David Rowland's lab from New Zealand. He presented this a few times on conferences, and he kind of showed that even at higher intensities, fat oxidation rates do not really decline, they plateau. But what we see when we use the indirect calorimetry, so using VO2 and VCO2, so oxygen uptake and carbon dioxide production, to measure and calculate oxidation rates of either fats and carbohydrates, we see that after you surpass the first lactate threshold, you start to excrete more, kind of ventilation increases disproportionately to oxygen uptake, because you start to excrete more CO2 to buffer the the blood. And basically, because you start to excrete more carbon dioxide, you end up inflating the carbohydrate oxidation rates and suppressing fat oxidation rates. And this is kind of, very tricky to actually be very sure about what happens after the first lactate threshold because of this phenomenon. So in the future, like different or the other methodologies need to be employed to be actually able to determine correctly how much fat and how much carbohydrates are still being used at higher intensities.
So that's really interesting, and I had heard that from a few protagonists in the field before. So, are there any currently available accurate ways to determine what those substrate oxidation rates are beyond the first threshold? Because if I understand what you said correctly, it actually it holds true. So looking at VO2 VCO2 holds true until there's a disproportionate increase in VE or VO2, which is that first, it's called the ventilatory threshold 1. So under that threshold, it holds true, but then above it doesn't. Is that did I understand correctly?
Yeah, that's how I see it, at least. Okay. I mean, there are some like different arguments out there in the literature, and some say that you can go up to RER of 1.0, that you can determine correctly the carbohydrate and fat oxidation rates. But to me, just knowing that you excrete more CO2 because of blood buffering tells me that this can't be the case, and you are doing some kind of an error. And I think David Rowland, so a professor from New Zealand, has been trying for years to actually come up with a method using different tracers, so very complicated methodology to be able to determine this. But yeah, I only saw some data from some conferences. It looked nice, but yeah, those papers haven't been out yet, so we can only speculate at this point.
That being said, it is still valuable to measure those values under the first threshold to look at, for example, maximum oxidation rate of fat for an athlete.
This variable is very, like, it varies day to day, I think, and I think this is a bit of a problem. How useful it is for you, because it got me thinking a few years ago. So when I was doing my first PhD study, what we did was we depleted people of glycogen on day one and send them home with carbohydrates or without carbohydrates. Invited them back in the next morning, so they had very likely different levels of muscle glycogen, and they started exercising 1 hour, and then it was a time trial. But in this first hour, those people were able, some of them were able to oxidize like in excess of 1 gram per minute of fat, which is like very high, and they were not on a high fat diet. They were all just eating carbohydrates. They were not like massively trained. VO2 max was only around, like on average, around just about 55, I think. So not super high trained, so that energy demand, the energy output, the power output wasn't super high, and they were still kind of reaching the values that low carbohydrate people are reaching. We're just depleting them of glycogen. So basically, they have the ability to oxidize fats. It's glycogen concentrations in the muscles that are the biggest determinant of oxidation, carbohydrate and fat oxidation rates. So if you measure on one day and then you repeat a measurement of maximal fat oxidation rates in a few months' time, you can't really be sure that you're measuring a difference in ability to oxidize fats, rather than just having different starting glycogen concentrations in the muscle. And measuring glycogen in the muscles is not a very easy thing to do. So I don't personally find those tests very useful.
Very interesting. Would one way of normalizing those measurements be to look at the fat oxidation rate relative to maybe a baseline blood lactate value? As insofar as I understand, your blood lactate is going to be to some extent linked or can be influenced by your nutritional status in terms of glycogen depletion or ingestion of carbohydrates. Would there be any sense to say, well, and I'm completely hypothesizing here, would it be fair to, or would it be interesting to say, well, you can oxidize that amount of fat per minute given a baseline value of lactate of that much, and when you retest, if those values, if those lactate values are ballpark the same, do we have comparable metrics, or would that not hold?
In theory, it could,
Right.
but the problem you would probably get is the measurement error of lactate measurement, because most of the devices are not like super accurate. So especially not handheld devices, and even the biosensor, the capillary blood that you put in a small tube, has a lot of like variability, and I think he wouldn't be able to pick that up.
Very interesting.
So it would be very, very difficult.
Now, if we talk about oxidation, fat oxidation capabilities or capacity from one individual to another, you talked about up or upwards of 1 gram per minute of fat being oxidized. What is the range that we might see from maybe a metabolically compromised or diseased person all the way up to a highly trained cyclist or endurance athlete in general?
Probably like, yeah, those people that can't really metabolize fat would probably see the max fat oxidation rates to like 0.2 grams per minute, very low. But then elite athletes, I think the highest reported ever was 1.7 grams per minute, but I'm not like completely sure. And I think like most low carbohydrate people are reporting like 1.2 to 1.4 grams per minute. So I think like 1.7, that's highly trained person, and was able to oxidize this much fat.
When we talk about those developments, those adaptations that we're trying to induce with training, most notably, like you mentioned, in the realm of improved fat oxidation and metabolic efficiency, we want more mitochondria. We want a denser network of the mitochondrial reticulum. So obviously, when we want to develop that, we need to think about intensity control and determining the right intensity for those adaptations to take place. And that takes us into another area that you mentioned and that you cover as well, and one which Pierre on Twitter has asked about. So we can place the first Twitter question here. Can we talk a little bit about lactate testing? When and how, what are the best practices from your perspective in order to be able to establish precisely, or as precisely as possible, given the measurement errors and other confounding factors? What's the best way of using lactate testing to determine training intensities?
Yeah, so I personally, I'm a big fan of critical power, just the same way as James Sprague that you hosted some time ago. And so for the second threshold, I would probably personally like recommend using the critical power test. But for the first lactate threshold, I think that's very useful to do the measurement. So I usually see it like this testing in different ways, depending on what type of athlete I'm working with or kind of like looking at. So for instance, let's say we have an elite athlete for the first, as in the first example. So before each and every like lactate threshold test or lactate testing, I would probably make sure that the diet is as standardized as possible, and that when a person comes to the lab, he doesn't have elevated lactate values because of like a high fructose breakfast just before the start of the test. So I would probably make sure that he ate his breakfast like at least 2 hours prior starting the testing. And the previous day, mostly like carbohydrate food, because the testing is usually pretty demanding. So you want athletes to be pretty full of glycogen. But anyway, so for elite athlete, I would probably do the first lactate threshold, which I would probably do using like 6 or 7 minute long stages. So very small increments, pretty long stages that we really kind of find the first lactate threshold. So I see the first lactate threshold as 0.5 of millimole per liter of an increase over the kind of baseline. And I would also try to find the heart rate corresponding to this point, because I see that heart rate kind of is a very good marker to use, for instance, in changing environmental conditions. So for instance, in the heat, or for instance, or cold or at altitude, I think that like heart rate, if it, for instance, I can in the lab determine my first lactate threshold to be like 270 watts, let's say, and this occurs at like heart rate of 150. So in the heat, if I exercise at 150 heart rate at, I don't know, 200 watts, this will probably mean that I'm on the first lactate threshold. If I go to 270 watts in the heat, the lactate will just go much higher. I will be probably exercising close to the second threshold. So I think this is kind of, yeah, the way to go. And then for the second threshold, I would use a critical power. Then for a novice athlete that, yeah, comes to me for the first time, I don't really know him, I would probably use the 4-minute stages test with quite a few steps, so not huge increments. I would rather use more lactate strips, make less profit from the test, but just make sure that really we pick up the first and the second lactate threshold. So the first one, the definition would stay the same, 0.5 millimoles per liter of an increase over a baseline. And for the second one, I would use one of those equations using, I think it's modified Dmax, that was found to be like the most accurate one. And yeah, I would definitely be using 4-minute or 4-minute plus long stages. I think Inigo San Milan is recommending 10-minute long stages or even more than that. So yeah, I think 4 minutes is the shortest, other shorter stages that I would probably go with.
You kind of answered already, but I wanted to jump back on that. I was going to ask if you changed your what measurement method you would use to determine that first lactate threshold based on the length of the steps you were using. So you said plus 0.5 over baseline for both the 4 and the 6-minute stages. We know there's an impact of the step length on the lactate curve. Is it worth having different baseline plus, maybe 0.03 if it's a 4-minute stage, 0.05 if it's a 6 or plus minute stage? Does that make any sense, or do you feel like there's a fairly good consensus around that plus 0.05 over baseline regardless of the step length?
So it's actually, it's funny because those definitions, there are so many like different ways how to do it. And even like how do you define baseline, because usually like when you at rest, you take the measurement, it's for instance like 1 millimole, and then after the first stage it will drop to 0.9, and after the second stage it will drop to even 0.8. So what's the baseline now? Is it 0.8, 0.9 or 1? And I would probably take the average of those. So I would be a bit lower than like what would be like baseline based on the resting measure. But yeah, it's those thresholds are, you can probably like definitely see them on the graph when it happens. And I think you can't be really sure anyway, because one day the number is like 270, the next day it's gonna be 280. And I've been playing a lot with those measurements, and I remember doing once a test on my own. We were increasing the intensity every, I think, 10 minutes, but very, very small tests. I think I was on the bike for a long, long time. And I already like at one stage got above 0.5 millimoles. I was sure that I'm over the first threshold, but then the next measurement was again below 0.5. So it's, yeah. It also depends on the cadence, for instance, and so many things. So you're making estimations anyway. So
yeah, you're looking for an angle in a curve anyway. So it's a fool's errand to try and get the perfect one or the right one, because it's not right to begin with. It's a curve, and we're trying to find an angle. So, but I get your point about those different points. You talked about finding the appropriate heart rate or the heart rate that corresponds to that first threshold so you can work in different environments. For someone who doesn't have access to lactate testing, would multiple rides at different low intensities around that first threshold and trying to look at cardiac drift, would that be of any use for someone who doesn't have access to a lab or doesn't want to go to the lab, to at least estimate and get a ballpark idea of where they might have to ride or where they should ride when they're doing their low intensity work?
Yeah, I think like cardiac drift is a really good proxy of this as well. But the problem is with the cardiac drift is that many people when training at home don't have proper ventilation and cooling. So I think so you will definitely see this drift much earlier than you would see it outside, for instance. Because I remember a few years ago when I was chatting with Steven Zeiler about this cardiac drift, and he was really into it. And I did many sessions from him here in the labs for 3 hours, 4 hours, and looking for that cardiac drift. And simply like after 3 hours, there was no drift whatsoever. And we thought that I was at the first threshold or even like above, but there was simply no drift. And I'm pretty sure it was because of like proper nutrition, because we know that it's not like just hydration, but it's also like carbohydrate availability that affects this drift. So when I'm training, for instance, at home, if nutrition and hydration are okay, and the cooling is fine, then this drift in heart rate is definitely a result of being in the heavy exercise intensity domain. Whereas if nutrition and other things are not all right, then perhaps you're just assuming you're in the second above the first threshold, but you're actually not. So it's pretty tricky. But also like talk test is a good way. So if you can talk freely, then you're still probably in the below the first threshold. If you can't talk normally, then yeah, you're above.
Do you see an inverse relationship between blood lactate values and fat oxidation? You talked about, that lactate maybe going down in the first stages of the test. Would that coincide with a rising fat oxidation? We know that lactate also acts as a signaling molecule when it comes to free fatty acid availability and oxidation. Do you see a relationship there?
I think these low concentrations, lactate wouldn't have as big of of an effect as compared to at like concentrations of like 4, 5, 6 millimoles. So I think, yeah, this is probably not playing a big part, but definitely at higher intensities, high rates of lactate in the bloodstream probably suppressed to a certain degree lipolysis in the fat or the adipose tissue, but also because the concentration gradient between the bloodstream and the muscles for lactate is increased, and we know that mitochondria prefers lactate over other fuels. We definitely would be seeing like a reduction in fat oxidation rates because of like, at least on the paper, because of that.
The next one I wanted to get to, which we'll get to in a second, is a very prized topic on Twitter those days, is VLA max. So we'll talk about this in a second. Before this, I watched a few videos. I think it was, what's his name? Lionel Sanders, the triathlete, I believe, who I think it was a couple of years ago, he was doing a lactate clearance test. It's a fairly long protocol. I tried to hang on to what was going on and the length and the intensity of the stages, and I probably have to watch it again. In your opinion, is there anything valuable to be gained looking at clearance ability at different intensities and after different protocols? Is that something that is done currently in cycling to any significant degree? And is there value in it, in your opinion?
I'm not familiar with anything like that would be validated in terms of something that, yeah, I would say now, yeah, do that and you will know this. But definitely you want the lactate to be cleared away as quickly as possible, just from this effect of suppression of lipolysis. but how to like really translate this into practice, I don't know, and how valid these measurements are, I don't know either. But yeah, if I can continue into the VilaMax debate, I keep thinking, and the biggest problem I found with this VilaMax is that it has a unit at the end, and this unit is millimoles per liter per second. And it kind of shows that it's a physiological thing, whereas I'm pretty sure, and Mark explained it, and James explained it as well, we can't really measure lactate production rate in the muscles because we are making so many assumptions down the line. And I think it's just impossible. Whereas we know that coaches are successfully using this VilaMax approach and this metric. And I think we should kind of make a distinction between a physiological metric and just a metric for coaches, because we have coaches use so many metrics. It's training stress score and others that are just like based on some models, and they tell the coach some things that he should know the limitations of. And I think like VilaMax as a metric that has been used successfully can be useful for coaches. I just have the problem of explaining the underlying physiology of it, because it clearly, you can't say that you can measure production rate of lactate, especially because these days nobody actually uses the 15-second sprint to measure VilaMax. Everybody uses kind of a critical power testing to measure VilaMax. So you have, again, like sprint and then like 2 or 3 minute efforts, and then a 12-minute long effort, and then you get VilaMax, and then you get the critical power. So basically VilaMax is probably almost the same as W prime, I'm imagining. It's just calculated differently. And in my view, they should stop using the they can use the VilaMax, but don't explain it as a maximal production of lactate, and don't use the units, and then I'm perfectly fine with this VilaMax concept.
Yeah, again, if it works, and if coaches and athletes have success with it, as long as it works, if it works, it works, right? And like you said, maybe just the underlying explanation for it needs to be framed a little bit better. Because like you said, we don't know what's coming out of the muscle, and we don't know what's going back in the muscle either. And there's obviously other organs and places in the body where that lactate can go, and it's kind of messy under there. And like you said, making assumptions off the bat isn't always helpful. To go back to you talking about the lactate clearance idea, in your mind, if you had to hypothesize on either a protocol or when to do it, and whether it would be comparable from one instance to the next. For example, let's say someone does a critical power test and does a 3 and a 12 minute, maybe on the 3 minute, taking lactate before taking lactate at the, T+0, T+2, 4, 6, do you think we would see significant changes with somebody really developing that mitochondrial foundation over time? Will we see a clear difference in clearance? And could we account for all the measurement errors that go into, or all the co-founding factors that go into blood lactate values, given what we know?
I think it would be very difficult, because even if you take, like, for instance, lactate thresholds testing, we know that, for instance, people that are overtrained, the curve will be much lower. So the amount of lactate appearing in the bloodstream, the concentrations would be lower, and that would indicate, well, he's more trained. No, he's just overtrained. For instance, he perhaps can't access those glycogen stores as efficiently, and you can very quickly do wrong conclusions from such a test. And even like again, glycogen concentrations in the muscles would play a very big role. So I would be really cautious before recommending such a thing to guide the training, basically.
Okay, very interesting. Now, if we get out from under the hood and start talking about the application of nutrition let's say in the context of endurance sport and endurance performance, what are the pillars of nutrition when it comes to doing well, performing well in endurance sports, in your opinion?
So I think the most important thing is basically carbohydrate availability. I think that's crucial. I intentionally didn't say energy availability because I don't really believe that it matters. I believe in that it matters from which energy source the energy is coming from, that it's available for athletes. For instance, there is a pretty old study showing that if you decrease the amount of carbohydrates in the diet, you can decrease also testosterone levels. So it's very much all about the carbohydrates, and you want to kind of sustain the carbohydrate oxidation rates for as long as you can, because that's basically what's best for the for performance. And then the next thing is protein, getting enough protein in the recovery period to like balance what's been spent. And the last thing are fats, probably, from speaking of macronutrients, getting those essential fatty acids in. And interestingly, we don't really know how much of them we really require. So some argue we should go as low as, we can go as low as 0.8 grams per kilogram body mass per day. Some say 1.2 is the lowest limit, and we really don't know what's the lowest we can go and maintain health.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, I was going to follow up. What are the downsides of going too low on fats?
Yeah, so this was my, like, that's why I kind of mentioned the testosterone, because usually they say, oh, well, if you go too low on fats, that will probably mean that testosterone in males will drop. But a reverse can be true. So if you go too high in fat and too low in carbs, you can basically achieve the same thing. So it's very probably individual and very difficult to say. So it's also like what kind of fats you're having in your diet. Unhealthy one, or like the ones that are coming from meat or something, or like omega-3 from fish and healthy sources. So it's very difficult to say. And I've been myself experimenting with very low fat diets, and I never had any big issues. But still, there is no point in going overboard with carbohydrates. So let's be sensible in this regard, and also have fats in the diet, because they basically are essential. We know this, even if you, for instance, don't have the data to actually say exactly the amounts. We probably don't need to eat just carbs to fill up the glycogen stores. We can do that as efficiently, even with some fats in the diet. So
if you had to give some nutritional considerations for different levels of athletes that might be listening, I don't know how you might divide that by hours of training per week or by development level of the athlete. What I'd like to get to is, how should maybe an amateur cyclist think about his nutrition versus how might a pro cyclist have to think about his nutrition, and what are the main differences between those populations?
So the biggest difference is basically energy expenditure, or basically energy demands for training sessions. So the more people are training, the more energy they require. So when I plan nutrition for my athletes, I usually standardize the fat oxidation, the fat intake and protein intake. So let's say, for instance, for most people, I recommend like 2 grams per kilogram body mass of protein a day. Try to be like high quality, and perhaps I would go to like 2.5 or up to 3 in elite athletes, just because the amount of food they're getting in, we just 2 grams is not enough. And then I would set the fat intake basically somewhere between 0.8 for those that are not training as much gram per kilogram per day, and then go up to like even to 2 for elite athletes on a day when the demands energy turnover is high, but the carbohydrate demands are not as big. For instance, low intensity training session, and then the rest would basically be carbohydrates. And I always look one step ahead. So what the next training or session is. So I try to kind of figure out what the demands of the next training session are, like average power output, and then calculate the expected energy expenditure. And this way you can figure out how much carbohydrates you need to provide the athlete, and then spread this during and before.
What are the biggest mistakes that you see amateur athletes doing when it comes to their nutrition? And then are there some recurring mistakes that might be different than those that you see more commonly in the pro circuit?
I mean, it's always not getting enough carbohydrates, because people are scared of carbohydrates being unhealthy. And yeah, that's a big issue, I think. And also people consider fats to be healthy, and because the density of the caloric density of fats is super high, very small amounts of fats can add significantly to the energy intake. And I think this can be a big problem for most people. For instance, if you go like for a cycling holiday, which people do, you can easily overeat if you're eating biscuits and things like that contain a lot of fat. So this is probably like the biggest problem. And also like hotel food, it's full of fat. Like even in pasta, you get fat, you get oil, you get it's everywhere. And this all counts towards the end of the day. And you can easily be like losing on the amount of carbohydrates you can intake. So I think the biggest problem is this carbohydrate thing. And I think the same applies for professional athletes and even amateurs. It's always under eating on carbs.
Now, when and where might it make sense to voluntarily restrict carbohydrate intake? I'm thinking obviously more specifically about low intensity training. Is there a place for carbohydrate restriction around those sessions? If so, for whom and how frequently?
So I would consider it in two scenarios. The first one would be that we have an athlete that only has like 12 up to probably 15 or 14 hours a week to train. So he has fixed timing availability. So before those, and he's not like basically improving anymore as he's not a novice athlete. So basically for novice athletes and young athletes, I would never restrict carbohydrate intake. Whereas for those athletes, for instance, like middle-aged people, I might restrict the carbohydrates before easier training sessions just to create a bigger metabolic stress. And this way make the time spent on the bike more time efficient. So you would probably expect similar adaptations or molecular signaling resulting from an exercise session. Like if you do 2 hours time carbohydrate restricted versus 3 hours with carbohydrates was probably like, I imagine, be pretty similar in terms of like this is just like, just thoughts and just giving out numbers, but in that scenario that would work. And the second one, when I would restrict carbohydrates, is if someone was to try to lose body mass. I think you really have to make sure when you're trying to lose body mass that you fuel well for those high intensity training sessions. So I usually try to avoid any energy deficit before those training sessions and like really make the athletes to work as hard during the sessions. But then after it, I would say, well, the first meal carbohydrates, yes, to start the recovery, but then perhaps try to reduce the amount if the next training session is of low intensity. And this way, because this is a space when you can basically restrict the carbohydrates. And I think here people get it very wrong a lot of the time, because they undereat for the high intensity training session. They really struggle to finish it, and they just starve the body and after the session, they just crave all the food and they just can't restrict the intake anymore. So they just eat and yeah, they don't end up losing weight. So these are the two scenarios that I would consider restricting carbs.
Is there any situation where doing high intensity training while being moderately or maybe even severely glycogen depleted is a good idea or could be justified in your opinion?
For instance, this morning, I was thinking about something like this because I did like intervals towards the end of the session. And it's basically fatigue resistance thing. Because what happens at the end of the long training session or a race is glycogen levels are pretty low, but you're still to push out a lot of power. And I don't know if this helps or not. Like it kind of feels like, well, you can teach the body to still be able to produce a lot of power, but I don't know if the body understands what you're trying to tell it. So
do you think there might be a psychological maybe benefit for some that struggle with those ends of races where you're not as fresh as when you're doing perhaps a high intensity training session, and maybe spending a bit of time there can help you just get better at the task or tolerate the task better at the end of a race?
Yeah, perhaps it's psychological, and that would probably be the best answer to this.
All right, very interesting. Now, if we talk about carbohydrate ingestion during exercise, so what are the principles that we have to be aware of? How might we apply it best? In what context? So I'll let you take it from there. I know it's a broad topic, but I'll find some follow-up questions along the way.
So yeah, let's start with the general recommendations. So general recommendations say that you can ingest up to 90 grams of carbohydrates per hour. And this applies for, I think, training sessions that are longer than 3 hours, because obviously the energy demands are pretty high. And for everything less than 3 hours, 60 grams per hour is enough. And then we start talking about different types of carbohydrates. So when we talk about shorter training sessions, just glucose-based carbohydrates are enough, so maltodextrin. Or when you go above 60 grams per hour, you need to start adding fructose because, there is a limitation to, let's say, to the transport of glucose from the intestines into the bloodstream. So these are basically the general guidelines, but I don't think they are too simplistic in my view, and we should probably advance them a bit and start thinking about like the demands of the activity. So for instance, we can't really compare a female athlete with 50 kilograms and with the threshold of, I don't know, 4 watts or 3 watts per kilo, and like World Tour cyclists with 70 kilos and 6 watts per kilo threshold. The energy demands are just vastly different. And I think this has to be taken into consideration when we start talking about the amount of carbohydrates ingested during exercise. So for instance, like most professional cyclists these days are trying to hit 100 to 120 grams per hour ingestion rate. Whereas this is then actually oxidized, I don't know. And there are so many questions still in this area that, I just can't really pick a starting point to start discussing those, because I can talk for ages. So,
what for you are the most overlooked nuances that we need to consider, or that you would like to see the discussion move towards, in order to just elaborate a little bit more on that specific topic, and for people to do the right thing and get and reap the benefits?
So the first one would probably be to be able to differentiate between absorption and utilization on one side and tolerance on the other side. Because some people say, well, I can eat like even 150 grams of carbohydrates per hour, but without any problems. And they think, well, I'm oxidizing those carbohydrates, right? Because I have no gastrointestinal issues. That's actually not the case, right? Because you definitely have a tolerance, but you might not have the capacity to absorb and then actually utilize those carbohydrates during exercise. And this is something that people don't really get, in my view. So this distinction has to be made. And I don't really think that we should always be like striving to get as much exogenous carbohydrates into the body during exercise, especially not during those shorter sessions, because
what do you call short?
Primarily be focusing on filling up glycogen beforehand.
Yes, I'm sorry I cut you off. Because short for the common people and short for cyclists are two very different types of duration. So what do you qualify or quantify as short and or duration of activity that does not necessitate exogenous carbohydrates?
Yeah, like 2 hours, for instance. You don't need like 120 grams per hour for 2-hour long activity, right?
Okay.
And that's what people on forums and training indoors are actually doing a lot of the time. And just like, yeah, I'm doing great nutrition wise, I'm eating lots of carbs. No, doesn't work like that.
And is there also considerations given how much you train per week in terms of your training status? If you're untrained, if you're highly trained, do those also ask for some nuances in terms of the intake numbers we're looking at?
It's a difficult question, and we don't really know the answer, because if you look at individual studies, we see big ranges of maximal exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates, from everything from like 1.2 grams per minute up to like 1.8 grams per minute, for instance. And we don't really know what determines those rates, right? For instance, it's also like down to the methodology, how this is measured, and some methods that used in the past. I think quite some time ago, there was a study reporting 1.77, I think, grams per minute. The study was overestimating based on the methodology they used. So it's very, very difficult to kind of, get the numbers correct. And things like heat and just bad feelings can all influence the oxidation rates. I have my study just finished looking into 120 grams per hour. We're analyzing the data, and the ranges and the differences between people are huge, and I can't really explain why they are there. So this specific testing might be something interesting to explore, to individualize carbohydrate intake during exercise in the future.
Can you elaborate a bit more about the place that fructose plays in exogenous carbohydrate intake? I remember back in when I was training and competing for weightlifting, after a little bit of research online, I don't know if my information was good or not, but maltodextrin and protein, like whey protein, for example, seemed to be a good way to go, whether it was during a training session or for a very long weightlifting training session or after. But I, at least in that context, I never heard the word fructose play into the picture. So when should one consider fructose as an addition to what they're doing with exogenous carbohydrates, and why?
Yeah, so this was the topic I wanted to start next, actually, the fructose. So there are a lot of misconceptions about fructose, because for general public, fructose is considered to be like the worst of the worst in terms of carbohydrates. And the reason being that fructose first needs to go into the liver, where it is converted to other metabolites. For instance, it can go into glucose, it can go into lactate, and it can also go into fatty acids. And these fatty acids, triglycerides, are basically the problem that people talk about and obsess about. But the fact that it goes into the liver, I think, is very important from both recovery standpoint and also during exercise. So let's stay for the during exerse. for a while. So fructose, when it comes to the intestines, is transported into the bloodstream using a different transporter than glucose. So this means that, let's say that we saturate the transport of glucose with fructose, you can go a bit higher. That's why up to 60 grams per hour, it's glucose only. Above, you just need to add fructose. So that's kind of the basic concept that everyone talks about. But also, because fructose goes to the liver, where it's converted to lactate in glucose, you get, or actually you see with fructose co-ingestion, you see increased lactate levels in the bloodstream. And because lactate is uptaken by the muscles the same way as glucose, basing down the concentration gradient, you see an increased concentration gradient for lactate. And as a result of that, you get higher exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates without altering, for instance, blood glucose levels in the concentrations in the bloodstream. So I'm not completely sure that the story about absorption is the limiting or the most convincing one, because I think this concentration gradient in the bloodstream is even more interesting, because you want to kind of increase concentrations of lactate as a result of fructose ingestion. This way, I think fructose is very effective to reduce the reliance on glycogen, let it be liver or muscle. So it kind of works. And there are like a lot of debates, what's the best ratio for fructose to glucose. And usually, like so far, most products were either fructose free or had 2-to-1 ratio glucose or maltodextrin versus fructose. But there is a lot of research, again, mentioning David Rowland that I mentioned earlier. He very nicely showed in quite a few studies that probably the best ratio is very close to unity. So very likely 1 to 1 to 1.8, oh no, sorry, 1 to 0.8 glucose fructose. So basically almost the same amounts of glucose and fructose. And sucrose, basically table sugar, is almost optimal in that regard. Because probably if you increase the fructose as much as possible, you increase the lactate as much as possible. And this way get a bigger concentration of lactate in the bloodstream, higher concentration gradient, and then higher exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates.
Is there any place for simply eating fruit at any point? Obviously, maybe not in a race or a highly competitive environment, but if we're thinking about, I don't know, a long hike in the mountains or something like that, might a fruit be enough, be sufficient, or be appropriate as a source of fructose?
Yeah, although we have to be aware that fruits are have different amounts of fructose, and it varies a lot. So it can be like almost 1-to-1 ratio, or it can be barely any fructose in certain fruits. I don't know the examples from the top of my head, but yeah.
Okay, I was going to ask, my next question was, what is the perfect 1-to-1 fruit? So for those who know, please leave that in the comments below, or in a Twitter thread, so that if someone wants to just eat a fruit, they can find the perfect ratio of glucose to fructose. We maybe should have a little chart of fruits and their ratio between those two. If we think about ultra endurance events, is there any special considerations there in terms of the form of the different exogenous glucose and maybe fructose that should be taken in?
Yeah, I would probably stay with the same recommendations, because ultra endurance requires you to eat a lot on the go, and gastrointestinal discomfort can be very prevalent. And this way, by combining both types of carbohydrates, you kind of minimize the risk of having residual carbohydrates sitting in the gut and not being absorbed. By utilizing both transporters. But so I think like kind of this still makes sense. And I was actually speaking at a conference a few weeks ago about ultra endurance athletes and nutrition, and I was like, yeah, well, you probably shouldn't be eating like fats on the go or some solid foods, and really try to go with liquids. I don't know. I know that's not as tasty perhaps as some solid foods, but if you want to maximize performance and reduce the risk of having issues, I think that's probably the way to go. It might be a bit unpopular recommendation, but yeah, that's how I see it.
I'd like to talk about relative power considerations next. So cyclists are usually looking for the best power to weight ratio. When do cyclists, or maybe more broadly athlete, but let's say on cycling, when do cyclists need to think about the advantages, the potential advantages that additional body weight might bring to, for example, power output?
I think the best example are hill climb races in the UK, where you start at the bottom of the climb and you finish on the top of the climb. That's where watts per kilo matter the most. And I don't think there are many races out there that actually just start at the bottom and finish up on the top of the climb. And most races actually involve flat sections,
right,
where it's absolute power that's determinant of how good you are. And yeah, in a way, having a very high watts per kilo, but having low watts absolute power, you just can't do anything on the flats. And I think we can see this pretty clearly on the results on the time trials in professional cycling, because those very, very light riders simply can't perform super well on the time trials, just because their absolute power output is not as high. And also, like when it's windy, they might have problems. And I think it's not always just about watts per kilo. It's important, but we really have to think, well, what I'm going to achieve if I try to increase the watts per kilo. And sometimes you just work on the mass decrease, but you also reduce the amount of power you can produce, the absolute one. And I think that's, yeah, it's very tricky thing. So you have to really think what kind of racer you are. Are you doing the hill climb champs in the UK? Yeah, that makes sense. You want to be as light as possible, but anything else, you really need to reconsider and think about what matters most for you.
Well, shout out to Tom Bell, previous guest on the podcast, who won the championships last year, I believe. So some pretty impressive watts per kilo numbers right there. Next, I want to go through a couple Twitter questions that we got. The first one is from Chris. He asked, how many packs of Haribo do you think you could eat in a day, and have you tried?
Probably I'm pretty sure that I did at least 4 200-gram packs a day, because when I do glycogen loading before certain events, or just before certain like rides on my own, I try to go very low fiber and very low fat, and I think Haribos are a perfect solution to this. Yeah. They also contain a lot of fructose, which I like for recovery of or replenishment of liver glycogen. So it's a perfect food in my view, but I know people disagree with me.
Do you know what the ratio is there?
It really depends on the variety.
Okay.
So
very interesting. We'll have to dig into that as well. That's another chart that Twitter needs to make. Moran had another question. If you have the best way to estimate caloric output or caloric needs from a trail run.
So yeah, I saw this question and I was like, yeah, it's a very good one. So for instance, in athletes that I work with and they require like, or they want me to give them like exact numbers for caloric intake, they're usually like triathletes. And what I do is usually take the heart rate. So for instance, determine again, I approximately know the heart rate on the bike, for instance, like 150 is usually around the first threshold, and then figure out what this the first on the bike, the power output at this intensity is, and then translate this into another sport. because the heart rate should be a good proxy of oxygen uptake. And I think oxygen uptake is basically an indicator of energy expenditure. So this kind of works in a way. And in a similar way, I would probably, if I had a VO2 max value and a heart rate max, then you can probably, based on the heart rate, figure out what the energy expenditure during running is. And I think this is also how like Garmin and Polar and Suunto are doing their estimations. Firstly, they figure out the training status, so the maximal aerobic power, or however we call it, and then based on the heart rate, where it is relative to the max, they figure out the energy expenditure. So if those calculations get the VO2 max correctly, then also probably energy expenditure is pretty spot on.
Interesting. So going back to the lactate testing conversation a little bit earlier, would VO2 values during maybe a lactate threshold testing session be interesting, given that then we can have VO2 values for different intensities and matching heart rates maybe more precisely than with the VO2 max and working off percentages?
Yeah, for instance, sometimes we actually do, we don't do the lactate threshold testing, but we do like ventilatory thresholds. And then we actually determine at which VO2 is actually occurs the first threshold or the second threshold. So we actually have the VO2 value, and then we forget about the efficiency and the power output, like whatsoever. And if we then match this with heart rate, then we can probably again figure out pretty good where what corresponding energy expenditure for a given heart rate would be.
Very interesting. The last question I wanted to go into with you is, I named it Bridging the Research Gap. I don't know if it's the right one, but I'll try. How can we shorten the gap that exists between research papers, articles that we might find in different publications, and what coaches use and apply in the field every day, so that we can maybe improve, or standardize is not the word that I'm going for, but just make accessible to the most coaches possible the best practices that currently exist? How do we reduce the gap that exists between what researchers might know and then what coaches might apply on a day-to-day basis?
I think we should start communicating more. I think that's the biggest problem, because a lot of coaches perceive scientists as people in white coats that have absolutely no clue what's going on in the applied world. Scientists usually just like love to hear stories from the applied world and discuss implications of the science they do with the coaches. And the same story is with myself. Like, I come from both backgrounds and try to like bridge those. And it's no better thing to talk about your own findings with someone from the applied perspective and try to kind of get those findings into the applied setting. For instance, about applying the fructose-based breakfast, or I don't know, different ratios into the practice, and just try to explain to the coaches and then trying to find solutions. And that's why I really enjoyed doing for BORA, for instance. I might not have like as much practical experience as the other nutritionists, but I have this science background, and together we can really, really work well together. And I think coaches shouldn't be afraid to be asking people with PhDs or professor titles about their work, because they are most of the time more than happy to provide them with answers. And I think the biggest problem is to try and read the paper on your own, just reading the abstract, for instance, and then just making a wrong conclusion. Because most of the time studies are designed in a certain way so that the problem being asked was basically investigated and the answer provided. But this is very specific context, and only the scientists kind of pick this up, whereas coaches will say, well, this study is shit. No, it's just that you don't understand the point of the study and its limitations, because we all know that there are limitations, but you can always learn something from the science. And this communication, I think that's what people are missing.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that this conversation will be part of this effort to make all this latest research accessible to all the coaches who are interested in finding best practices and applying them with their athletes. So Tim, where can people find you online if they wish to learn a little bit more about what you do?
It's a funny one, because I used to be pretty well known for my Instagram account, where I was dissecting science articles and finding interesting things in them. But I got blocked from Instagram, so I don't have an account anymore.
Do you know why?
No idea.
Have you found a way to recourse this?
No. So at the moment, I don't have Instagram. Maybe it will reappear, and I might make a new one. But at the moment, I just can be found on Twitter. That's pretty much it. But I will be back to Instagram hopefully pretty soon.
Well, we look forward to your return there. I was not aware of your work actually before you got deleted or blocked from Instagram, so I wasn't privy to all the great content you published there, but I look forward to either this account coming back so I can go back and see what you did before, or seeing the new Tim account coming up pretty soon. Tim, thank you so much again. It was a lot of fun chatting with you today, and looking forward to exchanging with you at some point on either Twitter or hopefully Instagram.
Yeah, it was great. Thanks for having me.
Take care, man. Thanks for listening to this episode. If you would like to support the podcast, please take a few moments to leave a written review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts. If you want to watch this episode again, you can find the full video recording on my YouTube channel. You'll also find hundreds of hours of free content, all my podcasts, my thoughts of the day, structured presentations, and more. So don't wait, go subscribe, and I'll see you in the next episode. Take care.